Yeah, maybe because this gets at another question that came up in chat right after, which was, can Alchemy replace Terraform? And I think that is a really good question. That's right on the money.
Yes, that is directly the goal. Love Terraform, great product, but like I don't want to use Terraform and I don't want to use tools built on Terraform. I want everything to be in TypeScript. Like part of our goal, I tell the team is like, hey, can three dudes with AI do what took $500 million to build by hand, Terraform? Can we just generate all the resources? And the answer is absolutely you can. And in fact, you can generate way better resources. Like they're all built natively in Effect and they're all built in TypeScript, and AI can just write them now. 10 years
Sam,
ago, that was
are
a
you
bunch of people.
comfortable?
Huh?
Real quick, I'm getting like a bunch of questions to drop the link to your V2 website. Is it okay if I put that in the YouTube chat?
Yeah, put it in there. Just don't post it to Twitter because I haven't fixed the OG images. They're terrible, and Twitter caches them for like 3 weeks. uh, don't do that.
All
There's
right,
a
chat.
tool that allows you to uncache it.
Is there? Okay, well there you go. Post away, I guess. Yeah. Thanks. I didn't know that. Yeah.
I shared it
By
in
the way,
in
I
the
have a
YouTube chat.
kind of question around the strategic choice of Alchemy. Obviously, like in infrastructure as code, you have two different ways to approach the same problem. One is what, for example, Terraform does, and in keeping a stateful representation of what is deployed already, and then diffing against that state. And the other way is kind of what
Kubernetes.
Ansible does, where you don't have a centrally preserved state, but your deployment should check what is already deployed and what's not.
Mhm.
I'm curious to hear generally your take on the differences between the approaches and why you choose the stateful approach with Alchemy. And the background is, in general, I find the Ansibles easier to use, albeit more complex to implement. And I've seen nightmares where we've lost the Terraform state and we had to, like, okay, now what do we do? The infras code part doesn't know anymore
Right.
about what exists already. Where do we go from here? And
Yeah.
obviously,
Kubernetes is kind of the same, right? It's
yeah,
it's not a plan. It's a constantly resolved, rectified, healing
it's a
system.
reconciler basically.
Yeah, reconcile. Well, I want to support the whole reconciler thing because that's the fastest way to deploy to Kubernetes. If you run this at Kubernetes, you're waiting for stuff you don't need to wait for, right? Like it's just going to resolve everything. Um, I don't have a good answer to like why planning I think is better. I think it should support um, whatever it can, but like my experience has always been this experience. I guess is my answer to that. I don't know why Ansible is easier. If you lose your state file, um, you can't lose the state file. Don't lose the state file is what I would say to that. I'll have to
Yeah, I
think
mean,
about it some more, to
we
be honest. A good question that I hadn't really prepared for in my mind. I'll think about that more.
I'm
Always,
I
here for hard questions.
yeah. I'm leaning into like it's still this is Terraform, like declaring infrastructure, building a plan. I think the plans have value of being able to be audited, analyzed, automatically updated. I don't think it's directly incompatible with the reconciler system. At the end of the day, you have a graph that you're deploying to a system that reconciles it. We'll have to cross that boat when we get into Kubernetes, because Kubernetes should absolutely not work in this like graph way of like deploy one, wait for it, deploy the other, wait for it. That shouldn't happen, right? Another problem that DAGs have, like the Terraform Pulumi approach, is circularity is not easy to do. Things like Ansible and Kubernetes can do circularity a lot easier, right? You just put out the references and then it reconciles. But I will say that that is a problem that I've always hated in these types of engines, and Alchemy has solved that with a different lifecycle. We support circularity in our resource graph. So we can deploy everything out circular and then it resolves it in multiple steps. So Our engine is kind of a reconciler, actually. You could run that anywhere, but I'll have to think more on like, hey, why did I actually do this? I don't have the right answer to that, but like, I think you can make this work in any way you want at the end of the day. It's a declarative graph of infrastructure. How we resolve it is then pluggable and changeable. Um,
I
so
do
I'll think,
think there's something to be said, Sam,
yeah.
about the planning aspect that you bring up. Like, I think having the ability to run a plan and see if your infrastructure is like valid before you deploy it. I
Mhm.
think that that is one guarantee that you get with Terraform that you don't get with Ansible. You're responsible for dealing with a dependency with a
Yeah.
solution like Ansible, whereas with Terraform, as long as you manage your state file correctly, you get a dependency by default. Like that's just how Terraform is meant to work. I mean, it's not one. There are exceptions to the
Everyone.
rule, of course, but yeah, but like that's the idea behind products like Terraform. Whereas Ansible is really meant to be like a configuration management tool and an automation tool. I think that that's where I kind of see the value in tools like Terraform. It's like, especially as somebody who was an extremely heavy Terraform user in previous roles, uh, being able to plan out infrastructure, especially when you're deploying at an enormous scale, is much better than the guarantees that something like Ansible gives you, in my opinion.
It's almost the difference between a Docker container and an EC2 instance, right? It's like, sure, you can run Chef on EC2 and hope and hope that it figures it out. But you kind of want more guarantees up front. So like this plan, the way that we've designed it is the whole that plan of like these resources and this graph is known to TypeScript. It's known to Alchemy, and TypeScript can check it for you. Alchemy can check it for you. We can layer in compliance and auditing and requirements, all the good stuff that you would want on top of a graph engine, right? So like, and things like pricing estimations is a great one of like, hey, you're going to deploy your infrastructure, and here are the estimates for like how it will change. Having a representation of the plan is useful. And overall, I just feel nervous with reconcilers compared to
Yeah,
some sort of plan. But it's a good question, and it caught me off guard. I'll have to think more about. Hey,
I think I, I think there could be like a world where Alchemy also has the ability to operate in more of like a in more of a configuration management approach, or a agentless config management tool kind of approach. But for the moment, like I see an exceptionally large amount of value
mhm.
in the way that the direction that you've taken, because for somebody who's again deployed a very large amounts of infrastructure, like the planning, the guarantees that you get, the control that you have over the things that are being deployed, I see an enormous amount of value in a project like this. Before we move on, there have been a bunch of really good questions that have come in, so maybe we could run through a few of them for you, Sam, and you can sort of answer them for folks.
Yeah, sure.
So this one user asked, if the infrastructure and the code are the same, then they are coupled. No, is there a decoupled way to deploy the same code to multiple targets?
So two things I'd say to that. One is there's this if you need decoupling, there's a way to do decoupling. If you want like a strict boundary between the code. But also these things are just effects, right? So I could take this code here and I could just replace this with and mostly I just have to swap out a few bindings, right? So like I have these layers down here. You just provide a different layer for how to interact with R2 in AWS, and now you have basically a generalized piece of compute. Like here's a service, and I can run this in AWS Lambda or workers, and Alchemy underneath will actually figure out how to wire that up. So if you're deploying to AWS, it'll create an IAM role, make sure that the Lambda function has access to that, and then can access Cloudflare via API. So that's a way of decoupling is layers, right? How do we decouple in effect? Is layers. So I'll pull up my landing page here because I got one example. Is you can sort of watch this oscillate. This is components of infrastructure, right? So it's going to swap between D1 and DynamoDB, and you can see here that you can write code against an ordinary effect service, right? Context.service. Um, and swap that out, and then it encapsulates the infrastructure requirements. So here we're using Dynamo, and in the other one we're using um, D1, right? And but the user's code that you write can be totally abstract of what infrastructure it's running under, right? So the answer to that is what the same thing we would do with effect, right? And
Yes,
just
you can almost like code your infrastructure to an interface, or you can code your infrastructure to an interface the same way you do with your applications in effect. Like the infrastructure just becomes like, you could abstract things into interfaces and like provide your concrete implementations just like you do with your normal effect programs, but now you're operating on the level of like infrastructure as well.
that's right. Yep. And these things can have all sorts, like not just like method calls. We can do. I can talk about syncs and event sources. Like they can do very interesting things. One example that we have of this is Better Auth. So like we have a Better Auth service here that you can use, and then we have one implementation which is D1, right? So you can just bring that in. You're running on Cloudflare. You grab the D1 layer, and you now have Better Auth in your app with D1. Or if you're in AWS, pick Dynamo or whatever, right? Like a totally different way of distributing components of services, not just components of infrastructure, like the business logic and the infrastructure together as a layer. So there's different layers to decoupling, right? There's decoupling out of effect. That's what that where is it? That's what this is for. Decoupling out of effect. Hey, like effect is great. I want to use it, but every now and then I need my own little async worker to do something with it. So that's how I escape out of that. And then, hey, if I'm in effect, using context service and layers to decouple from specific infrastructure details is how to do that.